They were the quiet black couple who built the airline from nothing but the flight attendant, stopped them cold and said, "People like you don't belong here." How far does quiet dignity go when it's up against loud prejudice? Now let's rewind to the terminal, where a single glance nearly rewrote everything. Victoria Gaines stood at gate 12 with the rigid posture of someone who believed her job wasn't just to manage order, but to enforce it. Her eyes moved sharply over each passenger approaching the first-class boarding lane, scanning not just for boarding passes, but for something else. Something she couldn't name but had always trusted. A feeling, a type, a look. Then they appeared. Sir Charles Monroe walked with a quiet grace, his back straight, his cane tapping gently against the polished airport floor. Beside him, Evelyn Monroe strolled with the kind of confidence that didn't come from diamonds or designer brands, but from knowing exactly who she was and who she didn't need to prove it to. They were dressed modestly, a tailored navy jacket for him, a cream shawl over a soft olive dress for her. Understated elegant, but not flashy, and apparently not enough. Victoria's hands shot out before they even reached the line. "Excuse me," she said crisply. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Dr. Monroe paused. Evelyn gave a polite smile and reached into her handbag, pulling out 2 crisp boarding passes. 1A and 1B, she said calmly, holding them out with gentle assurance. Victoria didn't take them. She didn't even glance at them. Her lips curled slightly. Half smile, half suspicion. "There must be a system error," she said, shaking her head. "That section is reserved for our premium elite." She stepped slightly to block the path, her arm lowering subtly, not dramatically, but just enough to signal, "You don't belong here." A hush seemed to ripple outward. The couple behind the Monroes shifted uncomfortably. A child nearby stopped mid-giggle. The ambient hum of the terminal, once innocuous, suddenly felt loud and distant, like background noise to a scene that no one wanted to be caught watching but couldn't look away from. Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned slightly toward her husband, who remained quiet. His gaze locked on Victoria, not with anger, but with a piercing calm. The kind of calm that said, "This isn't new." Victoria cleared her throat. "If you'll just step aside, I can have someone reprint your tickets and direct you to the proper gate for economy boarding." The word economy hung in the air like a slap. Evelyn looked down at the boarding passes still in her hand, still valid, still printed with their names, still ignored. She smiled, but there was steel in it. "We're quite sure we're in the right place," she said softly. But the moment had already fractured, and the eyes around them, they were watching, waiting, not yet sure whose story they were in, or who was about to rewrite it. The silence following Victoria's sharp dismissal didn't fade, it thickened, like humidity in the air. It clung to every corner of the gate. No one spoke, but everyone saw. Leah Carter stood just a few feet behind Victoria, clutching the flight manifest against her chest. She was young, maybe late 20s, and still carried the weight of wanting to get everything just right. She had checked the list twice this morning as instructed. She knew the Monroes were on it. Not just passengers, priority passengers, seats 1A and 1B. She opened her mouth to say something, but Victoria turned just slightly and shot her a look, a single silent glare. It didn't say, "Don't speak." It didn't need to, it said, "Know your place. Let the adults handle this." Leah's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at the manifest again, then back at the couple, still standing, still waiting, still being judged. Across the gate, Gerald Langford adjusted the strap on his leather briefcase. He had boarded hundreds of flights over the years, rubbed shoulders with executives and politicians. He knew the quiet kind of power, the kind that didn't shout but made things happen. And what he was seeing here wasn't right. He leaned closer to his assistant and muttered, "Is this how this airline treats its premium passengers now?" The assistant didn't reply. He didn't have to. A few rows back, Miranda Cross removed her oversized sunglasses, squinting toward the gate, as if drama were a limited-time performance, and she didn't want to miss a line. She turned to the woman beside her and whispered with that familiar syrupy superiority, "They probably got lucky with an upgrade. You know how some people get aggressive with those points." "Systems," the other woman nodded too quickly, as if agreement might shield her from being mistaken for someone like them. Back at the front, Evelyn Monroe remained still. Her posture didn't flinch. Her hands held the boarding passes gently, like she was used to holding truth that others refused to see. Her gaze drifted not with hostility, but with unnerving stillness, from Victoria to Leah to Miranda, then back to her husband. It was the kind of gaze that unsettled people, not because it judged, but because it understood. Victoria straightened her jacket as if reaffirming her authority. then waved the next group of passengers forward. She called out names, sharp, confident, decisive, trying to move the line along, but the ripple had already gone out. Something about her tone had changed, and the passengers heard it. A tension, a tremble, a crack. Dr. Monroe hadn't said a word, but he looked over at Leah just for a moment with an expression that didn't accuse, didn't pressure, didn't shame. It simply asked, "Do you see what's happening here?" And Leah did. She swallowed the edges of her clipboard, digging into her palms. Her knuckles whitened. She didn't know yet what she was going to do, but something in her posture shifted just slightly. She stood a little taller. Dr. Charles Monroe didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask to speak to a supervisor or demand the attention he had rightfully earned. Instead, he looked at his wife, and then he looked at his watch. There was a stillness to his movement, almost ritualistic, as if this wasn't the first time he'd had to choose between dignity and defiance. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim black phone. No hesitation, no emotion, just precision. He dialed. The sound of the terminal faded into a quiet hum as he lifted the phone to his ear. Evelyn remained at his side, calm as ever, her hand gently resting on the strap of her bag. "Charles," she asked softly. Not a warning, just a question, a whisper that knew him better than anyone else. He nodded, eyes focused ahead. Then, with the quiet certainty of a man who had used these words before, he said just one sentence. "They're at gate 12 again." Click. That was it. No name, no threats, no anger, no explanation. Just a sentence like a code understood only by those who needed to understand it. Evelyn's hand found his. She laced her fingers into his, steady and familiar. "You didn't want to escalate," she said gently, just loud enough for him to hear. He glanced toward her with the ghost of a smile. "No," he replied. "But I won't let them shrink us either." Around them, life carried on, or at least tried to. Boarding announcements buzzed overhead. Suitcases rattled over tiled floors. A toddler nearby squealed at a tablet screen. But something had changed. The air grew thicker, not with noise but with awareness, like the moment before thunder, like static before a storm. No one quite knew what had just happened, but everyone felt it. Leah Carter, still gripping her clipboard, glanced at the couple again, eyes darting between the phone now tucked away and the quiet confidence returning to Dr. Monroe's posture. She didn't know who he had called, but suddenly she had the sense that Victoria Gaines wasn't the most powerful person at Gate 12 anymore. Gerald Langford sat a little straighter in his seat, sensing the shift. His business instincts tingled. "Something's about to move," he muttered, mostly to himself. Even Miranda Cross, who had been whispering smugly just a moment earlier, now fell silent, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. Evelyn looked ahead. Her face was unreadable, but her presence, it pressed against the edges of the space like gravity. Victoria, still manning the gate, hadn't noticed anything yet. She was busy checking in another passenger, reciting her rehearsed welcome with mechanical cheerfulness. But the storm she had summoned, it was already on its way. Victoria Gaines stood a little taller now, shoulders squared as if the air around her belonged to her alone. The earlier unease lingering at the gate seemed to feed something inside her, a need to assert control. If she could project confidence, perhaps no one would question her judgment. She turned to Leah Carter and gestured sharply. "Start rechecking the remaining boarding passes," she said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm ensuring no imposters get through." The words cut through the terminal like a serrated knife. Miranda Cross nodded with smug satisfaction, her lips curling into a tight smile as she leaned closer to her companion. "Finally, someone's keeping the riffraff in check," she whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. From his seat nearby, Gerald Langford's jaw tightened. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic clink against the tray table louder than it should have been. His voice was low but laced with clear contempt. "This is getting embarrassing," he muttered, "and I don't mean for the couple." Leah hesitated, glancing nervously toward the Monroes, who still stood silently to the side, calm, composed, yet completely out of place in the scene Victoria had orchestrated. Her grip tightened around the clipboard, and her voice broke through her hesitation. "Ma'am, I really think we should." Victoria didn't even let her finish. "Leah," she snapped, eyes narrowing, "we're following protocol. Stay in your lane." The heat rose to Leah's face as she took a step back, the sharp words burning worse than a slap. Around them, the tension became palpable. Passengers were no longer just watching, they were judging. And then, without fanfare or announcement, he arrived. Officer Brent Willis walked up briskly, one hand resting lightly near his hip radio, He wasn't hurrying, but there was urgency in his presence. His uniform was crisp, but not flashy. His face calm, but focused. Victoria's face brightened, misreading the moment entirely. "Perfect," she called out, waving him over like a savior arriving on cue. "Officer, I'm glad you're here. We've had an issue with passenger misclassification." She gestured toward the Monroes still standing quietly a few feet away. "I believe these two may have been mistakenly assigned first-class seats. Could be a system glitch or a misunderstanding." Brent didn't look at them right away. He looked at Victoria. And for the first time since the gate had opened, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. His voice was calm, professional, but his words shifted the energy instantly. "We were told to verify something important at this gate," he said evenly. The emphasis wasn't on passenger. It was on important. Miranda stiffened. Gerald leaned forward, intrigued. Leah's heart thudded in her chest. Victoria blinked. Yes, that's what I just said," she replied, her tone faltering slightly. "We need to confirm their ticket class." Brent finally turned toward Dr. and Mrs. Monroe, and the moment his eyes landed on them, everything changed. Officer Brent stepped forward, clipboard in one hand, scanner in the other. His expression remained neutral as he reached out. "May I see your boarding passes, sir?" he asked politely, his tone measured. Dr. Monroe handed them over without a word. The officer scanned the first pass, then the second. His eyes froze for a beat too long on the name, Dr. Charles Monroe, then flicked to the listed title, Chairman Haven Air Board of Directors. There was a noticeable pause. His body straightened, shoulders pulled back. Face shifted from formal detachment to something more reverent. He handed the passes back with care, 2 hands, not one. Then, to the shock of everyone within earshot, he stepped back, placed a hand over his chest, and gave a short, respectful bow. "Sir, ma'am," he said quietly, "I sincerely apologize for the delay. I wasn't aware you'd be boarding here directly." The silence that followed was nothing short of electric. Victoria didn't move, couldn't. Her mouth parted just slightly, as if her brain had tried to form a protest, but the air had dried up. She stared at the officer, then at Dr. Monroe, then at the boarding passes still in his hand. Leah gasped audibly. Her eyes locked on the word chairman on the manifest she'd checked just that morning, and now realized she had read it, but hadn't understood it. Gerald Langford sat back in his seat, eyebrows lifting in stunned amusement. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Miranda Cross let out a faint squeak and instinctively tugged her sunglasses back on, as if hiding her eyes might erase her earlier comments from memory. And Evelyn simply smiled. It wasn't smug, it wasn't cold, it was knowing. She turned her gaze to Victoria and said softly, like a grandmother offering a life lesson rather than a rebuke, "People always assume we don't belong until they realize we built the building." The words floated into the heavy air, cutting sharper than any shouted accusation could have. There was no anger in Evelyn's tone, only a sadness, a tired familiarity with a reality she had encountered too many times before. Victoria's face flushed a deep, burning red. She opened her mouth once, closed it. Words for once abandoned her. Around them, the ripple continued. Gerald Langford let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head, as if watching someone lose a chess match they never even realized they were playing. Miranda Cross shrank back into her seat, sunglasses now, a feeble shield against the weight of her own embarrassment. Passengers who had once glanced curiously now stared openly, expressions a strange mixture of disbelief, shame, and grudging admiration. No one moved to board. No one dared speak. They were witnessing something bigger than a boarding dispute, something that touched pride, power, and the quiet dignity too often ignored. And at the center of it all, Charles and Evelyn Monroe stood, not taller than before, but seen for exactly who they had always been. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was expectant. Something else was coming, something Victoria Gaines would have no defense against. The silence stretched taut and trembling, as if the very air inside Gate 12 had forgotten how to move. Dr. Charles Monroe shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself with an effortless dignity. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't lean forward. He simply asked in a tone so gentle, it cut deeper than anger ever could. "What would you have done," he said, "if we weren't who we are?" The question landed like a hammer on glass, silent at first, but splintering everything it touched. Victoria blinked, her mouth working soundlessly for a moment before she managed to stammer. I just followed procedure." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the very uncertainty she was desperate to hide. Evelyn Monroe's gaze remained steady, soft yet immovable. She took a single step closer, not threatening, simply present, and answered for him. "No," Evelyn said, her voice as calm as a closing door. "You followed prejudice. You never even asked our names." The words fell between them like stones into a still pond, sending ripples outward that touched everyone within earshot. Victoria opened her mouth again, perhaps to protest, perhaps to apologize, but nothing came out. Because what argument could she offer against a truth so naked? From his seat nearby, Gerald Langford gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound more bitter than amused. He leaned toward his assistant and said just loud enough for others to hear, "I travel 200 flights a year, and I've never seen this level of arrogance." There was no venom in his tone, just exhausted disgust, the kind of contempt born not from shock, but from sad familiarity. Miranda Cross, still clutching her designer handbag like a life raft, lowered her head in shame. Her sunglasses had slid down her nose, revealing wide, guilty eyes that darted anywhere but toward the Monroes. She shrank into her seat, wishing perhaps that she could vanish into the carpet. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed rooted to the floor, her authority dissolving around her like mist under a rising sun. She looked at Charles, at Evelyn, at Officer Brent, who stood silently by, offering no rescue. The realization settled in her chest like lead. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't about boarding passes or protocols. This was about something she had chosen not to see. And now everyone saw her instead. The gate, the passengers, the crew, all of them witnesses. Not just to a mistake, but to a moment of truth. A moment when the veil of assumed superiority fell away and left her standing small and exposed in the glaring light of what she had done. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, nothing dared. Victoria Gaines stood rooted, her authority unraveling thread by thread. Gerald Langford leaned forward slightly, his keen eyes narrowing. Miranda Cross clutched her handbag tighter, wishing she could disappear into the upholstery. And then, like a crack through a frozen lake, came a sound, small, trembling, but undeniable. Leah Carter's voice. "I saw their names," she said, her words barely louder than a whisper. Every head turned. Leah's hands were trembling round the clipboard she had gripped so tightly. Her knuckles stark against her skin. Her heart pounded in her ears, nearly drowning her own voice, but she spoke anyway. "I checked the manifest this morning," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver more strength with each syllable. "I knew they were first-class passengers. I knew exactly who they were. And I didn't say anything." The admission hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Leah's mind raced a torrent of shame and regret. She remembered standing by, silently telling herself it wasn't her place, that protocol would sort itself out. She remembered her mother's voice echoing from some childhood memory. "Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice, and it always helps the wrong people." "I was scared," Leah said, almost to herself. I thought if I stayed quiet, it wouldn't be my mistake." But it was. Silence is a mistake. Her voice cracked and she blinked rapidly to hold back the burn rising in her eyes. Across the terminal, a different kind of silence settled, thicker, heavier. A silence not of ignorance, but of reckoning. Evelyn Monroe turned toward Leah fully, her eyes warm but unwavering. She stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, and with a gentleness that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken forgivenesses, she placed a light hand on Leah's arm. "You didn't fail us," Evelyn said, her voice soft but fierce. "You just learned when to speak." The words were not grand, they were not shouted, but they were seismic. Leah exhaled a shaky, ragged breath, as if releasing a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Her shoulders straightened, her spine stiffened. For the first time that day, she stood tall, not because she was certain, but because she had chosen. The impact rippled outward. Gerald Langford gave a small, approving nod, as if acknowledging a hard-won lesson being learned in real time. Across the aisle, another passenger, an older woman with silver hair in a crisp navy suit, whispered to her companion, "She's braver than most." Even Miranda Cross, who had tried so hard to remain aloof, slowly lowered her sunglasses completely, exposing tear-brightened eyes she could no longer hide behind. Victoria saw it all. She watched the shift, the quiet reassignment of moral authority from herself to Leah, from silence to voice, from fear to courage, and for the first time since the beginning of the confrontation, she realized no one was looking at her with respect anymore, only pity and disappointment. Leah turned back toward Evelyn and Charles, her hands still trembling, but her eyes clear. "I'm sorry," she said simply. No excuses, no hiding. And in that moment, it was enough. The air felt different now, charged not with judgment, but with hope. For the first time since the boarding call had been made, the gate didn't feel oppressive. It felt honest. But honesty, as Charles Monroe knew all too well, wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. Because change doesn't happen in apologies whispered after mistakes. It happens in the hard choices made afterward when no one's watching. And now that choice was about to be placed squarely in Victoria's hands. The stillness that followed Leah's confession was not empty. It was charged. Like the air before a summer storm. Like the moment a verdict hangs unspoken in a courtroom. Victoria Gaines stood frozen, her polished exterior cracking in places she could no longer hide. And Charles Monroe stepped forward, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the steady gravity of a man who had spent a lifetime fighting quiet wars. No one applauded. His voice when it came was calm, measured, immovable. "You can walk away from this." Charles set his tone low but resonant, blaming bad luck for getting caught, or you can stay and change. The words were simple, but they hit harder than any punishment could have. Victoria's lips parted, a tremble running through her shoulders. Her gaze flickered from Charles to Evelyn, to the passengers still watching. Silent but present. Witnesses. Judges, not of her fate, but of her truth. And then Evelyn Monroe stepped beside her husband, her presence as gentle and relentless as ocean waves against stone. Evelyn's voice was softer, almost sorrowful, but it cut deeper than steel. "Will you only apologize," she asked, "when someone holds power over you?" The question didn't demand an answer. It revealed one. Victoria's breath hitched. Something inside her, the thin shell of certainty she had wrapped herself in, splintered. Her hands, so often composed and commanding, now clutched each other at her waist. Her vision blurred. And for the first time that day, perhaps the first time in years, Victoria Gaines cried. Not the angry defensive tears of someone wronged, but the broken, raw tears of someone forced to face a truth they had spent a lifetime outrunning. She turned her face slightly away, trying to shield herself from the watching crowd. But there was no shield here, no protection. Only herself and the wreckage of choices made without thought, without care, without seeing. Charles watched her silently, Evelyn too. There was no gloating in their faces, no cruelty, no satisfaction. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about shaming her into submission. It was about choice. And Victoria alone held the pen that would write the next line of her story. There would be no formal reprimand, no shouting, no public spectacle. Just two open roads, the easy one paved with denial and blame, or the hard one cobbled with humility. Change and the grueling work of being better tomorrow than she was today. Victoria wiped at her face with trembling fingers. She inhaled shakily, the air catching painfully in her throat. Around her, the passengers waited, not for blood, not for humiliation, but for a decision, her decision. And somewhere beneath the weight of every watching eye, Victoria knew. What mattered now wasn't how she had fallen. It was how she would rise. Victoria Gaines stood there for another breathless moment, the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Then without a word, she straightened. It wasn't the sharp, mechanical posture she had worn like armor before. It was smaller, quieter but real. Her hands moved slowly, smoothing the front of her uniform, an unconscious gesture, not to display authority, but to gather herself. And then with a steady breath, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the cabin. No excuses, no proclamations, only action. Passengers watched her go, their gazes lingering not with disdain now, but with cautious curiosity, watching to see if her next steps would carry meaning. Victoria entered the first-class section, her presence no longer a looming force, but something different, measured human. She approached row 1, where Dr. Charles Monroe and Evelyn Monroe had finally taken their seats. Victoria stopped standing beside Evelyn's chair. For a moment, she said nothing, just gathered the courage it would take to make a simple offering that now felt monumental. Finally, her voice emerged, soft and stripped of its former sharpness. "Would you like something warm, Mrs. Monroe?" she asked quietly. Evelyn looked up at her, studying her face. There was no smugness in the older woman's gaze, no lingering bitterness, only the careful weighing of character. After a beat, Evelyn smiled, small but genuine. "Tea would be lovely," she said. Victoria nodded, the faintest flicker of gratitude crossing her features, and moved toward the galley. Meanwhile, Leah Carter stepped into the aisle as well, clipboard tucked under her arm. But this time it wasn't paperwork she cared about. She stopped by Gerald Langford's seat, first offering a professional but sincere smile. "Can I bring you anything, sir?" she asked. Gerald raised an eyebrow slightly, then nodded in approval. "Black coffee," he said simply, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. As Leah moved on, Gerald murmured to his assistant, She's learning. Just loud enough for Leah to hear. Across the aisle, Leah stopped by Miranda Cross, who had pulled her sunglasses down fully, now revealing uncertain blinking eyes. Leah crouched slightly to meet her gaze at eye level. "Would you like anything, ma'am?" she asked with a kindness that asked nothing in return. Miranda hesitated, unaccustomed to being offered anything without judgment. Then almost shyly she nodded. "Tea, please," she said, her voice a whisper. Leah smiled, not wide, not performative, just real. Miranda watched her walk away, and for the first time that afternoon, the bitter edge that usually clung to her softened. She turned to her companion and murmured almost in disbelief, "She's better than I was today." The cabin, once charged with tension and accusation, began to shift into something lighter. Not perfect, not forgotten, but healing, one quiet step at a time. And as Victoria prepared the tray in the galley, carefully setting cups and saucers without her usual hurried efficiency, she realized something simple, something humbling. True service wasn't about enforcing order. It was about seeing people, really seeing them. But a single gesture, however genuine, wasn't enough to erase what had been broken. Real change would demand more, and Evelyn Monroe wasn't quite finished teaching yet. The final boarding call echoed softly through the terminal, a low hum against the quiet murmurs still settling among the passengers. Soon the heavy doors would close, and whatever had happened here would be carried forward, either as a lesson or as a regret. The plane taxied slowly along the runway, the soft vibration beneath the cabin floor a reminder that movement once started was almost impossible to stop. Evelyn Monroe sat back in her seat, her hands folded loosely over the armrest. She gazed out the window at the wide, endless tarmac stretching into the horizon. Without looking at her husband, she spoke just a murmur, almost carried away by the engines. "This wasn't just about us," she said. Charles Monroe didn't hesitate. He kept his eyes forward, his voice low and certain. "No," he replied. "It was about every time someone doesn't speak up." The truth of it sat heavy in the cabin, undeniable and unadorned. Across the aisle, Leah Carter adjusted a tray. Her movements sure but thoughtful now. She stole a glance at Victoria Gaines, who stood stiffly by the galley entrance, her hands clasped lightly, her gaze lowered not in defeat but in reflection. Gathering a small sliver of courage, Leah crossed the narrow aisle and paused beside her. Victoria looked up, startled by the presence. She met Leah's gaze, expecting judgment or maybe pity. But Leah's expression was neither, just a quiet question. "What will you do?" Leah asked gently, "when it happens again?" It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a condemnation. It was an invitation. Victoria's throat tightened. She looked toward the Monroes, now conversing quietly. Their presence a steady reminder that dignity could endure even when battered by assumption. She inhaled slowly, deeply, as if drawing something new into her lungs, something cleaner than fear, something truer than pride. And when she exhaled, her voice was steady. "Next time," Victoria said, her eyes soft but certain, "I'll see them." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Leah gave a small nod, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly, not in triumph but in quiet solidarity. Outside the window, the engines roared to full life. The plane shuddered, then surged forward down the runway, gaining speed with a momentum no one could stop now. The ground blurred beneath them, the sky widened, vast and welcoming. And as the wheels lifted off, breaking free from the earth below, a kind of silence settled over the cabin. Not the brittle, fragile silence of judgment, but the deep, resonant silence of understanding, of change. Soft music played faintly over the speakers, blending into the low thrum of the flight. Passengers leaned back in their seats, their eyes drifting shut. Not in ignorance, but in weary peace. Miranda Cross tucked her sunglasses away, this time, not to hide, but because she no longer needed them. Gerald Langford scribbled a quick note in his planner, 3 simple words: "See them fully." And somewhere deep within Victoria Gaines, a different kind of checklist began to form. Not of seating assignments, not of passenger classes, but of people, real people, the kind she had almost forgotten to see. And as Haven Air Flight 276 pierced the clouds above, climbing higher into the endless blue, it carried more than luggage and itineraries. It carried the fragile, stubborn seed of something far more enduring. Respect, dignity, and the quiet, unstoppable promise of seeing each other clearly, fully, honestly. At last, this story reminds us that real respect comes from seeing people, not just judging by appearances. If it moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more powerful journeys like this. Your support inspires us to keep creating meaningful stories that stay with you long after the credits roll. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next story.